Good evening. My name is Richard Gazelle, Executive Director of In Defense of Christians. We're so glad to have you joining us this evening, and for those at home watching us online, welcome. Glad to have you. This evening we'll be discussing Syria in transition. What does the future hold and look like for Christians in an Islamist-governed Syria? After nearly 14 years of devastating civil war, the world witnessed Syria fall to Islamist militias in December 2024. While the collapse of the Assad regime was indeed a positive development for Syria and the world, the newly formed Syrian transitional government, dominated by Islamist extremists and foreign warlords who espouse an al-Qaeda philosophy, present an existential threat to Syria's vulnerable 2,000-year-old Christian communities and threaten America's interest in regional stability. The fall of the Assad regime and the subsequent rise of a new Islamist government in Damascus have brought with them both the promise of transformation and the peril of persecution. This event has reshaped the political and religious fabric of Syria, which will have an effect far beyond Syrian borders. For centuries, Syria's Christians have been caretakers of one of the world's oldest Christian traditions. For centuries, they've withstood waves of conquest, political persecution, and even genocide. However, their future has never been so uncertain as it is today. This evening, we hope to examine the implications of Syria's political transition on its Christian population. Will they have a place in the new Syria? Can religious minorities survive under an ideological framework that, at its extreme, has often marginalized or even persecuted Christians? And what moral and strategic obligations does the international community, particularly the United States, bear in confronting this challenge? This is not just a question of humanitarian concern, but indeed it's one of civilizational importance. The collapse of pluralism in Syria would not only lead to a tragedy for its people, but also a serious blow to America's long-term interests in regional stability, counterterrorism, and the defense of fundamental human rights. This evening's panel of distinguished speakers will provide key insights into these critical questions, and we look forward to hearing from them. With that, it's my honor to introduce our very first speaker this evening, Jonathan Schanzer. He's a senior vice president for research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's previously served at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Middle East Forum. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Remind me, how much time do we have for each of our talks? About 10 minutes. Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you, and thanks to everybody for coming out, and great to be on a panel with the other two speakers. What I think maybe I'll start with by saying is that as we've watched Syria go through the transition, it's reminded us a bit of some of the other transitions that we've seen throughout the Arab Spring, Egypt, Tunisia, et cetera, except this is very different in the sense that the job was over within, it seemed like, hours after the transition began. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, just rampaged through Syria, heading from the north of the country to the south, took over all the major population centers, or what the French used to deride as useful Syria, the eastern populated areas or western population areas of the coastline. What the Israelis did in response, I think, probably saved or bought us a bit of time. What they did is they ended up clearing out the buffer zone in the south of the country, making it a place that would be inhospitable to jihadi actors, at least on their borders. But then beyond that, what we saw was a steady campaign of the destruction of most of the heavy armaments that the Assad regime had in its possession. So we're talking about planes and tanks and heavy armaments. And what this essentially did is it kept the new regime weak. It left it unstable. And as a result of that, I think they may have, in fact, postponed the inevitable. What we now all expect from a jihadi or an Islamist regime that comes to power, where they would begin to exert that power and begin to crack down, perhaps more than they have, on minorities. I think when the Israelis weakened the new regime, it left them in a position where they had to appeal to the rest of the region for calm and for stability. And so it's for that reason we don't see clashes on a regular basis between Sunni jihadis and the Israelis, for example. I would also argue that what the Israelis did with the Druze was probably one of the wiser moves that they could have made, which is they vowed to protect the Druze at all costs. And what that did is it created a bond between the Druze of Israel and the Druze of Syria. They saw themselves as essentially one community, whereas before their loyalties had been somewhat split. But the concerns still linger, obviously, for the Alawite community, certainly for the Christian community, and without any doubt, the Kurdish community. These are minorities that I think are very much in the crosshairs of the new HTS regime. But I think that at the end of the day, much of this is going to hinge upon the patronage of two countries. And I think that's really where I want to focus the discussion for the remainder of my time. The regime in Syria is, without question, a proxy of both Turkey and Qatar. These are countries that, until recently, we had sort of derided as they were the axis of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're the radical Sunnis, but they were the minority within the region, right? That, the way that I think the region has been typically spliced up, at least simplistically here in Washington, is you had the Shiite axis on the one side. This is Iran and all of its proxies that have been waging war for the last year and a half. They're on one side. The other is, broadly speaking, the Sunni states, right? And that's 80% of the Muslim world, but you had to break it down into its component parts. In the Arab world, you talk about the pragmatic states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis. They do not have a particularly aggressive political posture as it relates to the rest of the region. What they've been doing since 2012, 2011 even, is trying to combat the advances of the Qataris and the Turks, who have tried to animate Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist movements from conquering territory. This was the model during the Arab Spring, and what we saw were battles that were taking place, sometimes ideological, sometimes financial, sometimes military, between the Muslim Brotherhood axis and some of these other countries that were trying to contest their advances in places like Syria, in places like Tunisia, Egypt, even Yemen. We saw it state by state across the board. I think our understanding was that somewhere around 2018, 2019, after the defeat of the ISIS caliphate, the understanding was that the Arab Spring, the tumult resulting from that, the contest between these different Sunni actors, that it had gone, that it was defunct, that there was no longer a battle. What we now understand is that the Turks had taken this time since the last 5 years or so to train HTS, to get it ready for the takeover of Syria, and to train it as a military. And that's exactly what we saw. We saw the overhaul of HTS, and it was a consolidation of a bunch of different factions that came under the leadership of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. I will still use that kunya because I think that it is his true name. Ahmed Ashara is the new name that he gives himself to try to come off as a bit more moderate or pragmatic. But at the end of the day, this is a man who is still taking orders from the Turks. We now know, based on reports of everybody that I know that has gone to the new Syria, there are Turkish advisors in just about every diplomatic meeting that is held with a foreign government. We understand that the lira is what is used in the open market when they're buying and selling goods in the major population centers. The Qataris, who are the other partners in all of this, they're the ones who are paying the salaries of the government officials, who, by the way, are made up of a lot of the foreign fighters and other factions that once made up this patchwork of jihadi groups. This is the project that I believe Turkey and Qatar had hoped to fulfill in places like Egypt and Tunisia, and they failed. They tried their hardest to bring down Assad back in 2012, 2013, where we watched them both bringing in large numbers of jihadi fighters, large amounts of money, large amounts of weapons. The whole goal was to bring down the Assad regime. We thought that they had failed. They didn't fail. They had suffered a setback, and they took a step back from there, and now they're back at it. So the question then becomes, what are the levers of influence or power that we have as this dynamic changes? The question that I've asked, and I think we're probably not going to get a good answer, is what the U.S. can or would do to provide help to the people of Syria as they potentially find themselves in a struggle with the new regime. Right now, it's premature. I think right now things are calm, and we see a lot of areas that are self-governed by different minorities. But we are potentially moving in a direction at some point, if this is still a jihadi regime, and I think it is, I think we expect it to begin to show its true colors. The question becomes, what will the United States do? And I would argue here that probably the answer is not much. We've now seen that President Donald Trump has come out and congratulated Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the strongman, the president of Turkey, for his conquest of Syria. This does not bode well for having the Turks contained or restrained in any way. It means that very likely the U.S. is going to give the Turks a green light to be able to give Jolani a green light to govern Syria as they see fit. So as I look out right now at the options that are available to help contain potential flare-ups inside Syria, I think a lot of it will come down to self-sufficiency of the Syrian people, figuring out ways to strengthen their own individual communities, and by the way, also working together. So letting go of past animosities with the Alawites, which will not be an easy thing to do. Working with the Kurds, who will be under fire from the regime itself and from the Turkish government. The Druze, again, aligned with Israel. I think that's going to be a very interesting dynamic and one that's hard to assess. But really, when we start to look ahead, I think we need to think about what the counterweight will be to the neo-Ottoman aspirations of the Recep Tayyip Erdogan regime. This is a man who would like nothing more than to spread Turkish influence beyond the conquest that he's made in Syria. And remember, this is a man that's also been supporting Hamas. He's been supporting Islamists in Egypt and in Tunisia and beyond. His aspirations go as far as the Horn of Africa and even beyond there. The Turks right now are eyeing the potential for something very new, something very different, and it has caught the attention and raised the alarm among a handful of allies in the Eastern Med. And this is where I think we have the potential for pushback, and this is what I'm going to be watching. And I do think that this is the safeguard that the Christian community will be looking for. And here I'm speaking specifically about the governments of Greece and Cyprus, potentially teaming up with Israel to provide a counterweight to the rising neo-Ottoman power in the region. We're getting a sense now that intelligence has picked up. There's more concern about what's going on inside Syria. I think everyone's learning from scratch who the players are, but there is, I think, a determined effort at this point not to let Syria become a full-blown sanjak, if you will, of the Turkish Empire, if that is indeed their intent. There is talk right now of joint patrols in the Med with the Hellenic countries and Israel, naval patrols to contain the rise of a potentially aggressive Turkey. These are the sorts of things that we're going to be watching right now. But I would say that in conclusion, this is still a situation that is very much in flux. We've not yet seen the true character of this regime. It is still finding its footing. When it does, is where I think the problems will begin, and it will be smart to have plans in place with allies of the Christians and other minorities in Syria to ensure that stability is the number one priority. I don't believe, again, that it will be coming from here in the United States. This is going to be one of those moments where the region will likely have to fend for itself. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Our next speaker is Gregg Roman. He's the executive director of the Middle East Forum. He studied national security and political communications at American University, and his opinions and analysis have been featured in several major national and international news outlets. Gregg, welcome.
Thank you, Rich. Should I get this up a little bit? Guys hear me okay? Great. I want to start with a story that took place about 2 months ago when an Israeli delegation was in town for the first meeting with President Trump. It wasn't just with him, it was members of the National Security Council, State Department, Defense Department, and the subject of Syria came up in a conversation. And an Israeli official asked point blank to his White House counterpart, "We don't expect you to maintain an American presence in Syria, especially in the Kurdish regions, but we would like you to make sure that Russian military police stay in Qamishli and al-Hasaka." Now, why would an Israeli ask for the Russians to stay in a buffer zone between Turkey and the Kurdish areas of Syria? It's because the only force that the Turks feared were the Russians. And insofar as the community in Qamishli and al-Hasaka, the Christian majority communities that live there, have not faced as much pressure from the Turks as other Kurdish areas in northeast Syria and other cantons, it's because there was a dual-feared actor that was present to be able to not necessarily depend on American national security concerns being threatened in that area, but an actor who the Turks and the new nascent Syrian government would not want to deal with. This is not to give props to the Russian government, nor to any Russian so-called peacekeepers or military police, but there's ideas that are present to be able to secure Christian communities in Syria, which may not be part of conventional policy thinking in Washington. And I start with that story because I want to sort of lay out what I think are the top line issues that Christians in Syria and their supporters outside the country have to worry about, offer the most shocking evidence of there being the intent of the HTS government in Damascus to eliminate the Christian presence as much as is possible without drawing too much international consternation or condemnation, and also to share with you what I think it means, and then offer some policy perspectives. If we could do this in 10 minutes, and Rich, if you could give me the 1 minute mark so I don't go over, I'd appreciate it. 5 things you need to know about Christians in Syria right now. First, Syria's ancient Christian community, where popes have emanated from. 20 members of the Syrian community on their first Nicene Council, trying to really divide what it meant to be Christian in the modern world, starting in 600 and 700, is facing extinction, especially following a pattern of systemic and systematic persecution since the takeover of Damascus by HTS and its Turkish and Qatari backers in December of 2024. HTS militants and other foreign fighters, including the Syrian National Army, many of whom are not sanctioned by the United States government, even though they have ties to al-Qaeda, to ISIS, and other derivative Islamist groups, have perpetrated violence against Christians, including murders, property seizures, and mass killings, very similar to the massacres which took place in Western Syria in March. The evidence also shows an alignment between HTS and Erdogan's anti-Christian policies, suggesting a regional pattern in this rise of neo-Ottomanism to eliminate Christian enclaves. And there's also, despite their public statements of tolerance, HTS actions that demonstrate an implementation of increasingly restrictive Islamist governance, including the announcement by Gilani a month ago to have Islamic rule over a transitional period in Syria, even though this contravenes and contradicts what he said at his outset to his rise to power in the end of December of last year, for the next 5 years. And we've seen that executed in the country. We've had distilleries shut down. We've had Christian property in Damascus seized by HTS to have weapon storage facilities put in its place. We've seen intimidation and fear, and even killings of Maronite, Greek Orthodox, and other Christians specifically targeted by members of the regime. And because of all of this, I'm going to end, after I go through the evidence, with a call for the United States to help establish protected zones and condition any recognition of the HTS government or its derivative powers on verifiable protections for religious minorities, including Christians, Druze, Alawis, and Kurds. So let's go to the evidence. The most shocking, and I think my colleague will speak about this more from the first-person perspective on the ground, hearing from his friends who are in Syria right now, so I'm not going to elaborate on it too much, is the HTS-linked militants massacring thousands of civilians in coastal regions, primarily Alawites, but also Christians, in the deadliest sectarian violence since HTS took power in March. There were documented murders of Christians, including Maronite Tony Khoury, and Greek Christians Tony and Fadi Boutros in Latakia last month. This is on the outset of before the rise of HTS and the overthrow of Assad, that Syria's Christian community went from 10% of the country's population in 2011 to less than 2% today, with Aleppo's Christian community declining from 12% to just 1.4% over that 14-year period. You've also had Christian religious symbols attacked by HTS militants, including burning Christmas trees in the Christian majority town of al-Silkabaya in December and vandalizing Christian shrines in Damascus in February. In March of 2025, as I already previously mentioned, Islamic law and the Sharia is now the rule of law in Syria. That's it. It's been declared, and you can expect the fate of Christian minority communities in Syria to face what happened in Iraq and the nascent, yet I think traumatic instance of the Copts and Christians during the period of Muslim Brotherhood rule after the fall of Mubarak. You also have had women targeted. Christian women on the streets of Aleppo, Homs, Latakia, Tartus, and other Syrian cities are facing violence for not wearing Islamic dress, with militants distributing flyers demanding compliance in Christian neighborhoods. You also have systematic destruction of Christian shrines and other religious sites. Now, since 2011, 120 churches have been destroyed, but there are continued attacks on historic Christian sites under HTS rule. You have armed intimidation, and I think the worst part of this, in terms of this religious minority persecution and religious cleansing, is the amount of Christians that have fled areas under HTS control, like Idlib prior to the takeover in December, and almost entirely depopulation of Christian communities in northwest Syria, except a few who get to put up a Christmas tree because they're being treated as tokens. So what does this mean? First, like Jonathan said earlier, HTS emerged from Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate, and it maintains its Salafi jihadist ideology despite its efforts to rebrand, with some very creative American interlocutors leading delegations of American rabbis to Jewish heritage sites. But that's just to get the headline. It's not to tell the story. You also have to look at the way HTS has ruled in areas prior to December of 2024, where in Idlib, since 2015, HTS implemented Sharia-based restrictions, including gender segregation, Islamic dress codes, and alcohol prohibition. So there's a war on Christian culture as well. For those who say that the one-woman Christian minister in Jelani's government is there to show diversity amongst Syria's new cabinet, this is because there is some Christian popular support out of fear, not out of endorsement. It's a survival strategy we've seen under other authoritarian regimes. And I would relate Hind Kabawat, this minister, to the Walid Muallim of Assad, Syria, or the Tariq Aziz of Saddam Hussein's Iraq. A token minister in name only. You have a quote from the deputy leader of the Syrian Democratic Organization, Bashir al-Saadi, who has warned of identity-based killings targeting Christians. And lastly, Christian communities on a whole throughout the Middle East have declined by 80% in recent decades, with Syria potentially following Iraq's pattern of Christian exodus. So what are we going to do? First, I think, as I said beforehand, there must be conditional engagement with the United States to any new government in Damascus. And to follow the example of Andrew Parsons, the American pastor kidnapped by the Erdogan government back in the late teens, that there must be devastating sanctions, including the implementation of the Caesar Act against Syria and any other Turkish interlocutors, that if there is continuous and ongoing persecution of Christians, they will not just face the sanctions they face now, but also there'll be secondary sanctions on Western countries that host these Syrian officials. You can't do business with people who are in the business of Christian persecution. The second is a federalist Syria, internationally guaranteed safe areas, establishing safety for vulnerable Christian and other minority communities must be provided with the idea that it's coupled with humanitarian assistance that must reach these communities through transparent mechanisms. There also should be efforts to maintain Christian heritage in Syria. As we said beforehand, one of the original areas of the Middle East where Christianity really bloomed 1,300, 1,400 years ago. And this means protecting sites, artifacts, and traditions from systematic erasure. And lastly, and this is more of the regional question, there must be a comprehensive approach to post-Assad Syria. The war is not over yet. If we think that 45,000 Sunni jihadis under arms, which now have a semblance of control in Damascus, will be able to rule southern Syria, eastern Syria, Kurdish areas, western Syria, This is only because the West allows them to. Does not mean the deployment of more American troops, but it does mean tacit, indirect support for Israel securing southern Syria, for the Kurdish areas of Iraq, even though they have a restive relationship with the Kurds in northeast Syria, to be able to maintain their somewhat fiefdoms, if you want to call it that. And also, as Jonathan alluded to, the rise of the 3+1 alliance, Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, to ensure that the exclusive economic zone that Syria has, which really bridges the area between Israeli waters and Lebanon, I'll discount that to the side since they have a lack of a navy. Now the Syrians don't have much of a navy either. But Turkey being able to patrol those waters and to make sure that it's a no-go zone for attempts to expel Alawis into the sea. And also to allow Turkey to control that in terms of their economic ambitions. So those 4 or 5 things I think can be done now. But the plight of Christians in Syria is real, and it must be acted upon today.
Thank you, Gregg. Our next speaker is Bassam Ishaq. He serves as co-chief of mission for the Syrian Democratic Council in Washington, D.C. He previously served as executive director for the Damascus-based Syrian Human Rights Organization. Interestingly, in 2011, Ishaq was a founding member of the Syrian National Council and later joined the Syrian Democratic Council in 2015 and currently serves on its Presidential Advisory Committee. He currently also serves as president of the Syriac National Council. One interesting thing about Bassam, he just returned back from Syria, and I want to congratulate him because this is the first time he was able to go back to a formerly regime-held Syria in about 15 years, which is a huge life milestone for him. I'm not going to speak for him, but he and many others like him never knew if he'd ever be able to visit these places ever again. But the way history works out is quite incredible and fortuitous in this case. So, Bassam, thank you.
Well, thank you for IDC for inviting me to participate today on this very timely and important topic. And I think it's probably destiny that it happens to be just like a week after I return from Syria, where I have spent most of my time with the Christian community in Damascus. So this was my first trip back to Damascus in almost 14 years after I had to flee my home in Damascus in 2011. I was working in Damascus as a volunteer directing the Syrian Human Rights Organization during the revolution. Before that, I was on travel ban by the Assad regime for my activities with the Syrian Human Rights Organization. So it means a lot to me, having lived many years under travel ban and then having to flee the country and to experience living under Assad regime, to be able to just show up at the Syrian borders, give my passport, and under 1 minute it's stamped and I'm free to go with no questions asked. I was really a very happy experience. And just like I experienced happiness this way, I found in Damascus that lots of people are really experiencing happiness. We don't know how long it will last, but for the time being, we are enjoying the freedom that we are experiencing. And one thing I noticed among the Christians and non-Christian Syrians is that they have gained their voice. You know, I've met people that I have known from before, and I'm like talking to a different person. Their personality is coming out, their voice is coming out. They have gained their voice, and their voice is not accommodating power, any power, whether of the past. They do admit that in the past they were afraid and they couldn't speak up. And they're even very open about where they stand on things as they are happening today in Syria. But I just wanna, balance things with the reality, because I felt one way before I left and lived there for 3 weeks, and then I came up with a different perspective after being there for 3 weeks. The Syrian people are tired from the 14 years of war that happened, and they're eager to reestablish order in the country. And this applies to everybody across the board, whether they are Christians or Muslims. And I think also I can say that in general, most of the Syrian people across the board, they are unhappy with what has been happening in the coastal area in Syria. It was a disappointment, and it's painful to all Syrians. Has happened there. Regardless of who is guilty and not guilty, I'm not addressing that. I'm just saying that there is a unity actually among Syrians, more than we can see just by looking at them as Christian, Muslims, Alawis, Druze, Another thing I noticed that, of course, there was no signs of support for any political side. You do see that now the independence flag, but it's not like everywhere. But it is there, and the independence flag is more of an expression of patriotism, which was not allowed under Assad. Then it is a political statement. The only time where I have been able to see any political statement was few signs that says one statement, Syria won. So this is how people see it. They have won over the Assad regime. But just so I don't miss the topic of the meeting, the Christians are, like everybody else, happy with the fall of Assad regime, with the freedom they have gained to be able to speak without fear and express their opinion. But they are worried about their future. But also they are not desperate. They have hope, and they want to find solutions. And they want to stay unless they are forced to leave. This is what I have found. And they want to find ways to actually work with this new transitional government. But they have their own views on things. Now, one main disappointment with the new regime in Damascus, the transitional regime, is the Constitution Declaration that was put forth. And I'll read you how it started. It started by saying, the religion of the President of the Republic is Islam, and the Islamic jurisprudence is the principal source of legislation. Freedom of belief is protected. The state respects all divine religions and guarantees the freedom to practice all religious rituals, provided that this does not disrupt public order. The personal status of religious communities is protected and respected in accordance with the law. Now, in these three, statements here, there is a lot to really digest. First, the indication that the president of Syria should be a Muslim, it actually is a put down as a second-class citizens to Christians. And it's a continuation to what was in the constitution of Assad regime and before that. The insistence that that the principle of legislation is the interpretation of Sharia. In a way, it's positive to the Christian, that it's the interpretation of Sharia rather than implying Sharia in strict manners. Because this could mean how you see Sharia. And this really gives a flexibility to the rulers in how they apply Sharia and interpret Sharia in practice. Now, these are important today to the Christians, and their security is, of course, most important. And there has been incidents where Christians have died in the coastal area. But there also, to be fair, there has been Muslim Sunnis who have died in the coastal area. Because when there is fightings and bullets fly, it's indiscriminate and people get caught in the middle and people die. So it wasn't a purposeful killing of Christians, and that makes sense. At this time, and historically always, since the Umayyad dynasty in Damascus, Christians didn't seek power and never held arms to fight the rulers. And they have no such intentions in the present or the future. So they are not a threat to really the new regime in that sense, that will justify doing any violent acts against the Christians. Now, there has been cases where individuals have seen in the change of power in Damascus as an opportunity and empowerment for their identity to impose their will on properties, homes, lands of Christians. But these are for sure not something that HTS or the new leadership has condoned or encouraged. And they're very limited. But one thing that the Christian community in Syria has come to conclude from these acts is that we need rule of law as soon as possible. Because without rule of law, and your economic security is compromised, and that will lead to immigration. So, in essence, and this is what I experienced in Damascus. And there is a difference because the situation in Damascus is different than other places. The further away you move from the center of power, there are more cases of imposition that takes place, not just for the Christians in general. So the regime, as was mentioned, has a problem in imposing its authority throughout the land in Syria because they don't have the power. You have HTS about 30,000, with the other fighters were altogether about 55,000. They could rule in northwest Syria, but with 50,000 to be able to impose authority over all of Syria, it's not possible. Actually, today, the strongest military power in Syria is the Syrian Democratic Forces, which composes about 120,000 fighters. So that's another dynamics. And talk about the Christians in Syria really needs a lot of time. But I just wanted to give you a report. What is the future? I want to, conclude in a few minutes. It depends a lot on what kind of Islamic rule, if an Islamic rule end up, taking hold of power in Syria. As I see it, it's not going to be easy for an Islamic rule to control the Muslim Sunni population, much less the Christian situation, because the brand of Salafi Islam is not popular in the Muslim Sunni Syria that has its own rich heritage of Islam that goes back to the Umayyad times in Syria when there was the first Islamic dynasty in the Middle East and beyond. So the future is pretty much, I think, rely on what happens with the current power, also with the international geopolitical game that is happening, that is out of the control of the Syrian people, the regional competition for power. As was mentioned here, Turkey is an important key player. Qatar, because of its economic interests, is an important player. But us as Syrians, whether Syrian Christians or Syrian in general, we're trying to find our way in the midst of all of these challenges. And this is why I think, for the time being, relaxing the economic sanctions that benefits the Syrian people and their way of life, I think is very important. Because how could we communicate with people if they don't have internet, if they don't have electricity, if they don't have water? So I think it's very important for the U.S. to play a role in enabling this communication with the Syrian people and within the Syrians. And this is, I think, to the interest of everybody at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Bassam, and thank you, each of you, for your insightful comments. I'd like to open it up at this point for questions from our audience. You can raise your hand if you have a question. We have a mic that's floating around. Just identify yourself, and be advised the mic doesn't amplify. It's just for our video stream.
This is yours.
Oh, thank you. Well, I have a question. While we wait for our audience to come up with questions, I certainly have one. A few, probably. So the three of you spoke on the formation of the transitional government, the formation of constitution, and the national dialogue. What we see is, somebody mentioned token appointments in the government ministry. One example that comes to mind is a Christian woman minister, but that's also counterbalanced and sort of reveals itself for what it is as a token appointment when you consider the Minister of Justice has a long resume as a scholar of Sharia jurisprudence, and the presidential declaration that Sharia law will be the basis for Syrian law. So when you see things like that, you realize, and it only underscores the fact that these are token appointments. So given these signals, where do you see constitutional formation? Where do you see that headed, despite our expressions? What are your thoughts with what's to come? And this is for anyone. And if we could bring the mic up here for the...
So I think if you look at the Geneva process, which took place from 2014 until the end of 2024, in which that token minister was part of it, there was sort of not a truth and reconciliation effort like you saw in South Africa or some other countries, which went through a transition from a minority oppressive or majority effort. But if you could turn Geneva into truth and reconciliation and recognize that maybe Western countries could establish a policy of tailored deterrence or tailored sanction, those who get on board with Syria that embraces ecumenical communions of the 14 or 15 different denominations of Christianity that are in Syria, that recognize limited Kurdish rights, that recognize the need to protect populations like the Alawites and the Druze, and even to differentiate between, like you said, the Syrian Sunni Muslims who do not want to accept the Sharia, and you put pressure on those who are pushing for a certain Islamic Sharia-based constitution versus others, that you can lift sanctions on those members of the general populace and companies and really drivers of the economy who are contributing to a unified, perhaps federal Syria, depending on which way it goes. But you're punishing and keeping down and tamping down those who are pushing for a Syria which will lead to a jihadi laboratory on behalf of the Turks and their neo-Ottomanistic ambitions. So if you can kind of split hairs, and not so much, but approach that from outside influence on the constitutional process, a process by Syrians, but realizing that there's consequences beyond its borders, maybe that's a way to be able to find a path that protects minority rights, but also make sure that it's not Sharia dominant while still respecting a majority of the Syrian people.
Right. Thank you.
It's a reports that I have heard from people for vis-a-vis the justice system. So till now, we don't know where the justice system will be going. There are courts that is operating, not in all courts in all aspects. Like buying, selling of property is pretty much stopped now. It's not happening. And you see the satisfaction of Syrians of all background about what's happening in the courts. We can't say or point only to Christians. But in some courts, there is a fear that it will not be a colorblind court system. So we really need to have in Syria, in order to protect the minorities and also the majority, to have a colorblind system that is not run by power behind the screen. So this is something on the mind of many lawyers that I met. Yes, they were Christians, but this was on their mind and they want to watch for. And we need to watch for that. If a Christian has a right, that, it should be granted by a just court. But if he doesn't, he shouldn't be granted. That's accepted, But not to have a situation where if every time a Christian go to a court against a Muslim, he loses every time, then this is a problem. So this is an issue that I heard a lot about vis-a-vis the justice system.
Just one point to make. I think that any attempt right now at creating a centralized government under the HTS regime with the patronage of Turkey and Qatar, I think is going to end poorly. I think what we need to be looking at least for the interim, is a federated approach. I know we've had some problems with that approach in places like Iraq, and it's not worked out well, but just because we failed at implementing that once doesn't mean that we couldn't push for it again. I think the big difference is we don't have American troops there. We're not, or at least not many. We don't have the scars of war where the distrust for the United States will be there. I think if we push for a federated approach for the time being to allow for autonomy and to allow for the rights of the minorities in Syria, I think we're in a much better place. I haven't really heard a lot of noise from the international community about this. My hope is that that's where we end up going.
Thank you. I think Sam had another.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment about the federated approach. I think, if we look at the situation in the coastal area, I think the mistake was made, in my opinion, that there wasn't involvement of the local population in developing a policing for the area. Now, you have examples in northeast Syria where Syrian Democratic Forces, where they captured areas that were of all Arab populations. They didn't put Kurdish or Christian Syriacs policing that area. They helped them develop their own security, and it's secure to this day. Although they may complain about things, which is natural, it happens everywhere, but they feel that they are part of the project, And I think HTS has missed that opportunity with what happened in the coastal area. And this is one thing we hope that be an example to point to them the value of autonomous models.
I have one quick question for each of our speakers. Thank you. I'm William Roberts at In Defense of Christians. We've discussed how the international community, particularly the United States, may not have the role it's been having in the region, particularly in Syria, in the past few decades. But given that the U.S. government has engaged with the Syrian transitional government, I was hoping we could have some specific reflections on the latest events, particularly the list of conditions that the U.S. government has sent to the Syrian foreign minister for an extension of the existing general license. Among these included the removal of foreign fighters from the Syrian transitional government's military for this limited, among others, for limited sanctions relief. Do you feel that more sanctions relief is necessary beyond that? Are those conditions lacking, and should they have been more forceful? I would love to hear your reflections.
I think there's a ticking time bomb that we didn't address, which is the Al-Hol camp and the other ISIS camps, which have some 40 or 50,000 ISIS fighters in their progeny, about 12,000 fighters, 30,000 family members, of whom many rule with an iron fist in an ISIS-like style within the borders of the camps, surrounded by Kurdish guards. What happens with them? That was one of the conditions, but I don't see HTS, who used to be in lockstep prior to their ideological divide, providing security for ISIS terrorists in the middle of the Syrian desert. If you're taking the M4 highway, which is about 40 kilometers south of the Turkish-Syrian border, and you kind of forget about the Aleppo Damascus Road or the Damascus-Baghdad highway, but you look in that center area where Palmyra is, and you go maybe 50, 60 kilometers outside, that's ISIS-controlled territory. I mean, the point that you made about them only having maybe 30,000 fighters under arms, the 25,000 in terms of those who they consider their allies. Are we going to let Erdogan now manage ISIS prisons? I just don't see how the transition from a Sunni jihadi Salafist group overlooking Sunni puritanical Muslims is going to be something that this government can handle. So there's not just the excise or the removal of foreign fighters. There's dealing with the problem, which is in the tens of thousands, spawning to 100, 200,000 within the next 5 or 6 years. So I don't know what they're going to do, but the administration has to get tough on that. That's why the current plans for reducing the force reduction from 2,000, which was an increase under Biden, now to maybe 800 and 900, is there primarily because of the ISIS problem that's still in Syria and could metastasize if it's not dealt with, either by Damascus, by the Kurds, or by American partners in the 46-member coalition. I don't know what's going to happen.
Just one point to make about the foreign fighter issue. If the total number of men under arms is 50,000, and let's say 20,000 of them are foreign fighters, and they willingly disband and get rid of those foreign fighters, how much of Syria are they going to control? We've basically asked the new regime to neuter itself, which they will not do. And so it is simply not something that is going to happen. But I will actually just say on top of that, I think we need to watch for the potential deployment of Turkey's S-400 air defense system. As I understand it, this is how they're trying to solve the problem of the CATSA sanctions and their inability to join the F-35 club. We've told them they need to get rid of the S-400, right, a Russian-made system. So they're saying that they want to deploy it to Syria. That's not how we solve this problem, and I think we need to make that clear as well. So there's a bunch of things, I think, right now. We've got a lot of knots that we need to untie. I'm sure everybody saw the Jolani interview today in the New York Times. It's clear he's making a big push for sanctions relief, and I understand the desire to provide aid and relief to the people of Syria, but I'm very concerned about what happens if we remove sanctions too soon without addressing some of those underlying problems.
I think we have a couple questions back here. We can start.
Thank you very much. It was so enlightening. I wouldn't speak positively about an Islamist regime as a victim, as a journalist in exile here from Turkey. So I think it will be very much appreciated if there is very few or limited trust to Islamist promises. If you remember, Erdogan promised us to make Turkey a member of European Union. Now look what kind of country Turkey is. So that's very important. But my question is, maybe Jonathan can answer. If Turkey has such a big influence on Syria, what if we focus on transforming Turkey? In Turkey there is a struggle, and Erdogan's popularity is getting less and less. And he put his main rival to jail a couple of weeks ago. So a Turkey which is more democratic, more secular, more West or Europe oriented will be an important asset for Syria's democratic transformation, if possible. So I think that's really important. But the concern is a member of Congress said that Erdogan jailed Istanbul mayor with an approval from American administration, which is very scary. I don't know what you think about this possibility of Turkey's transformation and then helping Syria.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, you said there is a happy mood among Christians in Syria. This is to the level that some Syrian Christians are turning back, returning to their homes that they left in 10 years ago or some years ago. That will be a good sign. I mean, if they are coming back or not. Thank you.
In answer to your question about reform in Syria possibly sparking reform, or reform in Turkey possibly sparking reform in Syria. Look, I don't see right now any will in the U.S. to try to push Turkey to transform. We saw no demonstrable response to the massive protests that came onto the streets of Turkey after the jailing of Imamoglu. There was nothing. I mean, there may have been some quiet conversations that took place between Marco Rubio and Hakan Fidan when he was here a couple of weeks ago. But really what we're seeing right now is the Turks making a bigger and bigger push for weapons sales, including the F-35. They don't look like they're a country that's thinking about reform. They look like a country that's looking to grow stronger and to have more influence over the region. So it would all start with a pushback on some of these aggressive maneuvers that we've seen from Turkey, and then eventually begin to shape the countries that they control, like Syria. But we are a long way from there right now, unfortunately. And I think it's a mistake, by the way, because I think Turkey is a pivotal country. We should see reform there, but this is not something that's a priority. It wasn't, by the way, I'm not going to single out the Trump administration. This is a bipartisan problem. Nobody wants to bother with Turkey. They think they're too big to fail. They're too important. They're part of NATO. Whatever it is, second largest army in NATO, all the things that people say about the importance of Turkey has actually made it that we've given up on asking for any reform, which is an unfortunate policy that needs to change here in Washington.
Yeah, if I can answer the second part. Yeah, I didn't run into any Syrian who has come back yet from the outside. I think they're waiting for more than the freedom that at this time people are experiencing. They need to see actually real economic recovery before these people can come back.
More questions?
We have one.
You sure? No, go.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all. I was just wondering, so I feel like in this town there's a lot of pushback against getting tough on Turkey because they're sort of seen as this potential counterweight to Iran and the strategic threat that they pose. And I've kind of gotten into arguments with people before, like, because they refuse to acknowledge the fact that the Christian persecution is so much worse on behalf of the Turkish state. And so I just wonder, like, what your perspective is on that, and if you could kind of help me with my arguments there, I guess.
I'm sure you have something to say on this, but I'll just say briefly that
Thank you.
Iran's loss is Turkey's gain. you are having a Shia crescent, which is being replaced with a Turkish scimitar, wherein Iran had control from the Eastern Mediterranean to its borders. Now you have the Turks trying to extend control on sort of a diagonal axis from all the way down the Euphrates into Iraq and then aligning with Qatar. And if you look at their distribution of forces, they're in the Horn of Africa. They negotiated a deal right now between Somalia and Ethiopia. They're really trying to get involved in Gulf commerce, which is frankly their effort to stop the India, Middle East, European corridor, the IMEC corridor. They see that as an economic threat to them, and they're really running on all pistons. But the Turks have problems of their own. You now have Turkish Cypriots fighting the allowance of the hijab in Turkish Cypriot schools. I think you have some blowback right now with the Kurdish efforts, and not just Imamoglu being put in jail, but also Saladin Demirtas and the Kurdish rule and the upset that's going on in the eastern part of Turkey. So they have their weak spots that can be taken advantage of. But if anything, Turkey is the new Iran. It's not a counterweight to it. It's just a Sunni jihadi entity rather than a Shia jihadi entity.
As we say in my culture, mazel tov. Look, I'll just say this. I've heard a lot of people, and there are people that are publishing all the time about how Turkey is the right ally and Iran needs to get pushback from Turkey. And that there is, I think we can acknowledge that there is a certain amount of competition that exists between these two. But let me just point out a few things. Number one, between 2012 and 2016, Iran got massive assistance from Turkey to move $20 billion in cash and gold, illegally circumventing sanctions. In other words, it was the Turks that helped the Iranians do this to break our laws. We'd actually have a court case that's looming right now at the Supreme Court. This is U.S. versus Halk Bank. Halk Bank is a state-owned bank, second largest lender in Turkey, that was responsible for moving the vast majority of these funds. In other words, Turkey enabled this from Iran. They have shared their patronage of groups like Hamas. Turkey and Qatar and Iran together supported this terrorist organization that just thrust the Middle East into war. You can't tell me that one of them is better than another. They were equal partners in the patronage of Iran, of Hamas. We've watched the Iranians provide support to the Muslim Brotherhood in the same way that the Turks and the Qataris have. People forget that after the rise of Mohammed Morsi, when he took over power in Egypt, the first head of state to visit him was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, right? So when we talk about this purported competition between Turkey and Iran, I actually see more mutual support when it comes to Islamism, when it comes to anti-Westernism, when it comes to anti-Zionism. They have a partnership. Yes, they have sparred over who controls Syria. That's clear. But you don't see a whole lot of competition in a lot of other places. You actually see more of a convergence. And I think that is a common mistake made by our brilliant analyst class here in Washington.
Thank you very much for the highlights, and thank you for all information. My name is Robert Özgun. I'm representing American Syriac Union, following Syria very close and following Turkey also. My question will be for, I think, Jonathan, for the first speaker. You talked about Turkey influence on Syria or on Jolani. What do you think, how much is that? It's really, really controlled? For example, let me give you an example. When we see SNA, it's not integrated yet to the Damascus. And when we see the old opposition or Istanbul opposition, they all resigned. And what's going on? That's some questions are coming up. Really, Erdogan controls Jolani as at all? Or there is any opportunity there that couldn't be controlled by Turkey? Because the other question is that I agree with you. The decentralization in Syria, it's very important, and Erdogan or Turkey, it's opposing that a lot. and those influences to be more weakened. What do you think we should do, or how we should do that? And just in my experience, and like a Syriac American Union that we are now trying to convince U.S. at the State Department or other level, it's, as Bassam said, we need in all Syria the police to be from the local people.
Yeah.
Like we don't need any HTS running around everywhere. And that should be pushed a lot, because in the whole world is like that. I cannot see any, maybe in North Korea not, but everywhere. Like my police officer in here, it's guy from DC or any other places, or in Europe. And I think we should push for that. That's just my advice.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Look, I'll say this, that I think the best response to, or the best way to counter Erdogan's desire to control, to have central control over Syria, is the federation model. And I think that's what the Europeans should be pushing for. It's what the U.S. should be pushing for. And in fact, I think we should be seeing support for this also from the Arab world. So I think, and organically, that's what's happening already. You've got pockets of control of different minorities that are taking care of their own security and their own services, because the regime is not, it lacks that central control. And so I think to the extent that we can build off of that, I think it will be a counterweight to Erdogan. But there's one other component of this, which I think is also important, which is that the Gulf Arab states are looking to try to provide a counterweight. They don't love Erdogan. You have to remember, they really don't like the Qataris, right? So where they see the Qataris and the Turks muscling in and trying to develop new territory as their own, this is where they push back, right? So we're seeing the Emiratis, we're seeing the Saudis and others trying to get in there and to vie for influence. I will say that right now, I don't think they're winning, but I also don't think that the game is over. They still have an opportunity, but it's a lot of money that they are potentially looking to spend, and for what kind of gain? To basically get control over a country that's been racked by civil war for 14 years, that's going to require billions and billions of dollars to rebuild. It's not exactly a terrific investment if you're looking for a return financially, but they are thinking about it, I think, right now from a geopolitical perspective, and that's why you're going to see the other Arab states try to push back.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Let's go over here.
Thank you. I'd love to ask, you've talked a lot about potential constraints that could be put on Jelani. What are constraints right now that are seen, whether it's internal to Syria or from external actors on Jelani?
Well, I hear the argument here about Turkey and its influence and Qatar as well. But I think the American presence, military presence, is a counter, big time, to Turkey and to specifically, and also to Golani. And this is why Golani, when he was in trouble with what was happening in the coast, he rushed into SDF and wanted to sign an agreement. So you see there the American role is effective in limiting the Turkish ambitions. So this is one constraint that I wish not to lose. I don't know if you want to add other constraints. Yeah.
I think that when you have some American Syrian diaspora organizations and their fellow travelers saying that the new government in Damascus is the best thing since sliced bread, that the credibility that they have in terms of going to bat for an al-Qaeda former principal and head of the al-Shams governing in Syria is really troubling. I mean, right before you had Jelani visit, I think, the Arab League for his first meeting, there was this leak that came out about photos of him at Camp X-Ray, which had housed members of Islamist insurgents who had been fighting against the U.S. and the Coalition Provisional Authority and the Iraqi government. I mean, you have to show who this guy is. And then when you start asking who are his supporters in Washington, you really have to start having the litmus test. Are they supporting Jolani because they see him as the only possible key to modernizing Syria and bringing everyone together, or having a federated model, whatever it looks like? Or are they going to bat because that's what their Turkish interlocutors are telling them to do? So I think one of the liabilities that he has is his support network outside the country. Inside the country, Jolani might be with us today, but there might be another coup tomorrow, and there's nothing preventing that from happening either. There's no real strong security architecture with a group that drove its way into Damascus 4 months ago. How deep are HTS's roots in terms of the internal security apparatus? It's not like they have a mukhbarat, right? But at the same time, do they really have control of areas inside Damascus, let alone outside in the periphery? I don't know. So Syria is still a wild card, and it could change tomorrow as much as we're talking about the way it is today or what he's saying in the New York Times. So we really just have to let events play out. But the role of the U.S., I think, is moving from one where we were involved in low-intensity conflict and anti-insurgency actions now to perhaps have some influence campaigns, both with public statements which are being made by the president, with the conditions that are being imposed upon the Syrian foreign minister and its government, but also maybe to work below the radar and to start empowering groups which will be able to have some teeth when it comes to the time of having a transitional process, going from this transitional government and then moving to something more permanent. So it really depends on what the U.S. is going to do, but Jolani's liabilities both lie within the state and also outside of Syria's borders.
I think we had one more. Yes.
So I certainly don't think that Jelani's the best thing since sliced bread. But I want to sort of play devil's advocate for him for just a minute here. And I think we don't really know what he thinks. You know, we're just going to have to sort of wait and see what he does. But I think it is interesting, as Bassem said, things clearly could have been worse for the Christians in Syria, and they're not. And, you know, again, we'll have to see where we are 6 months or a year from now. But suppose you're Jolani and you're a fanatic. You know, you're the second coming of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. What's your game plan? Because if you're just playing nice right now in order to curry favor with the Trump administration and get the sanctions relieved, aren't they just going to put them right back on once you show your true colors and you start to oppress the Christians? Like, what's the end goal here? Thanks.
The end goal is to play for time. And if what you're able to do, look, once you unwind sanctions, once you establish a modicum of legitimacy, the investment comes in, the corporations come back, the construction companies come in. What you do is you end up attracting investment. And then other people, large stakeholders, have a reason to want to support your regime. And you've got the Qataris and the Turks running interference for you over time, letting everybody know, hey, this constitution, I know it's not perfect, but this is the Muslim world and it's as good as you're going to get. And we start hearing that, right? You can imagine how this starts to play out. And so at the end of the day, Jolani plays for time. He gets to build back Syria to the extent that that's possible. He gets to refill his coffers. He starts buying Turkish weapons. He starts buying Iranian weapons. He starts buying Russian weapons. He rebuilds the state. He's able to defend it. And that's when you begin to see a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, a longer term strategy play out. This is what we all need to watch for. I think for all of us in this country that would like this to just go away quickly. And by the way, we hear it from the Syrians too, where they're like, hey, this is as good as it's been for a really long time. So just, can you let us have our moment? But the thing is that, and I feel for every Syrian that's thinking in these terms, but you have to understand that you are playing a game of chess and you're not going to win it in 2 moves, right? Jolani has a plan. Now, by the way, I'm not sure Jolani lasts, but it doesn't matter if he lasts, because there's going to be plenty of other people that are going to be willing to take his spot, who will be more than willing to answer to the Turks and the Qataris and still have an Islamist vision for the country. And that's ultimately, I believe, where they're trying to take things.
I mean, just to compare it to other Islamist revolutions, you start with disruption, but you make lasting change through incremental actions. So if you want to compare it to a car company, Jelani isn't the Pontiac or GM of Syria. He's Kawasaki and Toyota. He's changing the Syrian Corolla over 30 years. He doesn't have a vision for tomorrow. He has a vision for the next decade. So you relieve sanctions, you placate the West. Like Jonathan said, you invite in investors and people who then have a skin in the game as it relates to the success of Syria economically. And you can do whatever you want in your social, cultural, and political changes. Consolidate power, then make change. That's his play. That's what I'm worried about. That's the model of other Islamist changes that have taken place. And I think he's following the playbook. It's what Erdogan did since 2002, and now look at the country. So that's a 23-year venture. You know, we have to look beyond tomorrow. We have to look into 2030, 2040, and what Jelani's going to do by then.
Yes, I need to be an advocate for Syrians. I just came back from Syria. So there is the Caesar Act, and the Caesar Act limit really gives the U.S. a control over who from the outside could do business inside of Syria. And so there are ways where you could control who support and to support activities that could be done largely maybe in cooperation with people inside of Syria and for project that focuses on services to the Syrian people. Not something that is a grant or like buying weapons from Turkey or issues like this, but just for projects that target improving the quality of life for Syrian people.
Thank you. To our panelists, thank you so much. We really appreciate your remarks. To our audience, questions were awesome. Conversation was even better. So thank you all for being here and for contributing. And for those at home, we hope you enjoyed. And we look forward to having you in person, hopefully at some point. I invite you to check us out online at indefenseofchristian.org on social media, Facebook and X, and particularly on YouTube, where most of our content is, this program and many others. And I urge you to check out our podcast In the Middle, where we have a variety of very interesting guests having very interesting conversations. So with that, I'd invite you to please enjoy some food and drink and each other's company. Thank you.